Fortnite be fun? I know this question sounds stupid, but let me explain. Recently, Boop made this tweet. Should Fortnite's metas be fun or consistent? Players always talk about uncompetitive seasons, but the game would be boring if things didn't change season to season, or would consistent gameplay with the same weapons and meta be more ideal for competitive? Now, there's two sides to the story, as you've probably figured out already. The first one would be just similar to what BloodX says here. Changes are essential. This is for a few reasons. Most players would get bored of the same meta over and over again, since most players are teenagers with relatively short attention spans, but also Fortnite does have some fundamental issues with the competitive modes that make it slightly not that enjoyable, and constant changes act as a band-aid to keep the competitive scene a little bit more interesting. A great example of this would just be no good ranked mode, or no ranked mode. Get out of here, Arena. And even when you look at the larger player base who just plays tournaments, the majority of these are also still casuals who just enjoy the game and play tournaments. Another thing on top of this is that competitive is additive to the Fortnite Battle Royale experience. So obviously changes are good for the casual game to keep things interesting, keep things fresh, and for the general player base, a very good idea. But competitive basically just works with whatever meta they're given based on this. And an element that I've come to enjoy a lot is that players must figure out a new meta every 3 months or so when a new season drops, which really rewards the hard-working players. At the start of a new season, in the first couple of tournaments, there's always a player or two who does well every single season, and I think of someone like Queasy, for example, and I think that's one of the reasons that he's one of the best players right now, because regardless of the meta that he's given, he's going to play well at the start of the season, figure things out early, and then by the end of the season have it truly mastered. So overall, are changes really good for competitive? Well, there's obviously a flip side to this as well, because changes create a ton of problems for competitive players, the main one really being balance. Now, items are designed for the wider player base and kind of just plopped into competitive. And obviously this causes a ton of issues where the meta is extremely unbalanced. It's very different giving an overpowered item to a professional player and saying, hey, go crazy on the lobby with this, rather than giving it to a more casual player who doesn't understand how to abuse it as badly. And this is impacted massively by the time to update. Now, some things in Fortnite can't be hotfixed, meaning they can't just be patched instantly, one day later or another one. And I think the brick is a really good example of this, where, and clearly this is something that has to go into a full patch, which are only programmed every few weeks. So if it's a bug that can't be hotfixed, then it's just going to stay for a long time. And this has been kind of the case for a lot of the balance items, unfortunately, as well. Not only this, it takes time to get data on how broken these things truly are and to figure out what is the right amount of nerf that they need. And because it takes time, it means that metas usually evolve as the seasons go on, which can lead to updates happening really close to tournaments. And Epic has gotten a lot better at this, and I say something like map changes is a really good example, where we've not seen as many big map changes unless those things have been bugged throughout the middle of the season. But again, this still happens a lot. ODM gear, great example of that. Plopped in right before FNCS starts this season, and it's completely meta breaking. So there's positives and there's negatives to these massive changes. But what do these 3 seasons have in common? Chapter 2 Season 2, Chapter 2 Season 4, and then Chapter 4 Season 2, the current season. Well, if you look at Chapter 2 Season 2, this is often hailed as many players' favorite season. It's the first one that had mythics that were incredibly busted. And it's this really interesting balance where, despite the fact that massive changes were made that were incredibly uncompetitive, like having heavy snipers, RPGs, all of the mythics like the drum gun, assault rifle, minigun, and controller aim assist was also broken, this is still hailed as some people's favorite season of all time. Maybe that's just nostalgia's sake, but again, massive changes made and massively uncompetitive changes that were also made. Same thing with Chapter 2 Season 4, what people call Stark Season. How many mythics were in this game? It was unbelievable. Think about the Doctor Doom's mystical bomb. This was added in August 27th, 2020, so the first day of the season, and it was only removed almost 2 months later in the middle of October, and it was confirmed fully removed in November 12th because the initial removal was only for a bug. And so the majority of Chapter 2 Season 4, despite it being fun for Arena, landing on chests, getting pumps out of it, great fun, but it was incredibly unbalanced for competitive, yet it was still a lot of competitive players' favorite seasons. And then now, this season, Chapter 4 Season 2, I think it's fair to say the least competitive meta we've ever had. There's heal-offs, kinetic blades that are just infinite mobility, and now the ODM gear that can just fire through walls, fire through boxes. But this is largely due to the loot pool trying to match the public games as much as possible. And you can see that the competitive community is, I don't want to say more frustrated than ever because Season X existed, but the pro players are very frustrated. So what was the result from this? Well, if you look back to Chapter 2 Season 2, some of the content did amazing back then. Chapter 2 Season 4, Mongrel's FNCS win video has almost 9 million views. And then come to this season, well, I mean, YouTube content in general is absolutely booming. This has been the best month for me personally on YouTube ever. So you could say that big changes and an unbalanced, uncompetitive meta is usually a little bit better for the wider community and the game at large. And if I think back to some smaller changes, thinking basically from Chapter 2 Season 7, really all the way through to Chapter 3 Season 3, these weren't necessarily the most competitive seasons, but there were much more minor changes, and I can say from a content perspective that it just definitely didn't do as well as it is now. And how good content does is usually a good representation of how interested the larger player base is in the game. So this puts the competitive community at a bit of a dilemma. Big changes and crazy metas keep the larger audience watching and playing, which for the game to survive long term is key, but you have more and more frustration in the pro player base who want to give up and stop playing and are less motivated than ever. And so, like, what do you do? Well, as always, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. Bring back the mechs. That's a wee joke if you didn't get that. I think the real answer is, rather than should it be consistent or should it be fun, I think my answer sums it up very well. Consistently fun. Now, I would be all for splitting loot pools entirely and having different loot pools in competitive than we have from pubs, but it seems that as the seasons go on, Epic are reverting back to having the loot pools as similar as possible. And, you know, I don't necessarily agree with this change. However, if that's the way it's going to be, we need to figure out some way for the competitive community to be happy and to continue playing the game. And this is naturally going to lead to more unbalanced items being in the game. And for the longevity of the game, unfortunately, I do think some of the competitive players are going to have to get used to this. From what I've seen so far, the enjoyment from the pros of the meta doesn't necessarily correlate to success of the game. The most competitive meta would likely be boring for the wider audience, and since these two are linked, it doesn't seem like they're going to break that anytime soon. Viewership and player count are directly affect prizing, so if we had a more boring game, which the larger audience didn't necessarily play as much, Epic probably wouldn't be as incentivized to have larger prizing like it is now. So it's critical for the wider audience and the wider player base to enjoy the game as much as possible, and it's unfortunately more important than it is to have the competitive players enjoy the game. And this is mainly true because most competitive players, as we said at the start, are still casuals. And you may sit and say, well, what about CSGO and Valorant and League of Legends and a lot of these other games, but they can do it, so why can't Fortnite? And I think that mainly comes down to what is the player base interested in. The wider player base for CSGO and Valorant is very similar to the competitive player base. I know I'm sure if you play those games, you're going to disagree with that a lot, but it's significantly closer than it is for Fortnite. A zero build pub game couldn't be further from an FNCS finals. It's two completely different worlds. So trying to fit metas and things that are balanced for both is incredibly difficult. And another point that's really important that people forget, money talks. Now I want to say, straight up, this is not something that Epic Games have told me. This is my analysis of the situation, just looking at it from the outside. But with a lot of tournaments being put on the same day and on Saturdays and Sundays, these are always the days that are going to have the highest player count. Add solo cash cups and zero build cups at the same time on top of this, and what you're going to get is a massive spike in concurrent player base. Epic can then go to companies that they want to collaborate with and say, here's our peak amount of players, that's say 1.5 million players, and that's a guaranteed huge amount of eyes to be on whatever collaboration they're trying to strike a deal with. Not only does that lead to more money, that leads to more players being online to buy things from the item shop. So it's a win-win financially. So are us as the competitive community just doomed to having less balanced metas with larger changes over and over? Well, I think with the loot pools being similar between the regular modes and the competitive modes, going forward, Epic puts a larger focus onto balancing these items for competitive, but also keeping them fun for the wider player base. And this would hopefully lead to items like the ODM gear not being incredibly broken when it's initially added to the game, disrupting the entire meta and making me want to quit playing Solo Arena forever. And I think if one thing has been proven to be true, it's that some metas in Fortnite are gonna suck. Some metas are gonna be great, but regardless of the metas, the same teams still do well every single season. If you enjoy high quality competitive Fortnite content, click this video right now and see why it's so hard to beat Swizzy and Shamoki.